Hey, how's it going? My name's Paul Brandell. I'm the general manager here at Destination Unknown Brewery in Bayshore, Long Island.
And I'm Marshall Brown of the Long Island Conservancy, here today to give a talk on native plants.
Is this all from your yard?
Okay, here's that biosphere I was talking about. So you have boneset, New York ironweed, Joe Pye.
So what are we talking about? Native plants?
My name's Marshall Brown of the Long Island Conservancy. I'm here with Frank Piccinini, who is also with the Conservancy, but is also president of Spadefoot Design and Construction. They build native habitats. Done about 100 projects so far, is that right?
Probably more, by now, probably about 150, 200, something like that, yeah.
Yeah, so all over Long Island, projects big and small. And the Conservancy plays a complementary role in that we are all about habitat restoration. So the first thing, if you're going to restore habitat, you have to know what should be there in the first place. What's native, what's non-native, what's invasive. That began my journey, really. We planted less than half an acre. The yard I grew up in, Frank's company came in. This was just like June 21st, 2020. COVID had already broke. This was a window where we could get all these plants in the ground, and it changed my life. It absolutely changed my life. I've been in environmental advocacy for a long time, but I never really knew, this is more on the water side, Save the Great South Bay. I never really knew in my yard what I was looking at. I was suffering from this terrible disease called plant blindness. And I'm sure, we all suffer from it from one degree or another. We've been so separated from nature along, 100 years now. So it was like being Adam in the Garden of Eden again. You plant something, and the insect that's particular to that plant all of a sudden shows up, right? And then you say, well, what kind of insect? And then it starts doing the whole thing. And then you get a plant app on your phone to identify what you're looking at. And then you realize it's the UN. It's like there's hundreds of plants in your yard that have no business being there. And some are non-native, so they're just gonna hang and grow, die off, and not bother anybody. But then you have plants like lesser celandine is the latest thing. You've probably seen it around town, right? These little yellow flowers everywhere. Does that ring a bell? No?
You'll see it now. It's
right,
everywhere.
right. It's like, you will now. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. You think, is that daffodils? No. It escaped a garden in 1970 in Ohio, and has since covered whole forest floors, chokes out everything. And now it's on Long Island, practically every yard you look at, and it's a real chore to dig out. But if we don't, we lose that habitat. If we lose the habitat, we lose the local creatures who depend on it. So that's what's really at stake here. The big picture is, without native habitat, all the indigenous animals that rely upon that habitat will disappear. And they are in the process of actually doing that. That's the proof of it. So the goal is to get our open spaces in our yards up to like 70% native. If you take an app and you look around, it's probably about 25% now, which would explain why we don't see much life in our yards. But I'm here to tell you that if you give nature an opportunity in your yard, it'll take advantage of it. The native plants belong there, they thrive there. No need to water, fertilizer. They're used to not having much nutrients in the sandy soil here, and of course no pesticides. You're not trying to keep alive things that don't belong here. That's the basic principle of it. Frank, you would like to say
Yeah, I'll tell a little bit about my journey into this sort of niche world of native plant restoration, and so I grew up in a humble lot in North Massapequa, very happily. But to me growing up, nature was like that green space between the cities, right? Like, so I would look in my field guide, my reptile and amphibian field guide, scroll through and say, oh, these 5 species are supposed to be here. Where the heck are they? And I would look, and I would go look in the woods by me, the Massapequa Preserve, and I would find maybe the most common species, and that's it. And so then later on I went to school. As an undergraduate, I studied wildlife and fisheries conservation. Went to grad school and studied biology. When I really started to get my field experience, I was in West Virginia, right? And so about this time of year, salamander migrations happen, right? And just pouring off the hillside of these like colorful creatures that are about this big. Their faces look like cartoons. They're incredible, and they're supposed to be on Long Island too, and they are in certain places. So I came back, and as part of my studies, I learned plant taxonomy, right? So I learned to identify things, and oh, there's some invasive species here, but look at all these beautiful forests and whatnot. Came back to Long Island and was like, oh my God, the woods that I played in is predominantly invasive species. Big giant patches of multiflora rose. The remaining trees are getting choked out by English ivy and so on. So it was honestly a little bit, as a graduate student coming back to where I live, it was a little bit depressing kind of seeing this war that we're fighting really for humanity's future, but most people don't even realize it's happening. Right? We go into the woods and, oh, it looks pretty, lots of green here, but that green is largely invasive species. So, we started Spadefoot Design and Construction, how the heck are we gonna even approach this problem? It's so vast, but what we realized pretty quickly is that nature, if given the chance, is an incredible healer. All we have to do is steward the land properly. So we employ machines and that kind of thing, but it really has to be in the aggregate, right? So if we all did a little bit in our yards, it adds up to a whole lot. And Marshall's Yard's a perfect example. Like the first, we would go there and it was largely lifeless. Just a couple years later, by taking out some non-native turf grass and ripping out some invasive shrubs and whatnot, replacing it with native trees, plants, and herbs, and so on. And the place in the growing season, it's buzzing with activity. Monarchs, swallowtail, butterflies, hummingbirds, quail, right? Northern bobwhite. I mean, so random things that you wouldn't expect to find in like Sayville, they just come to you, and it's so cathartic for me as a professional out there, kind of doing this restoration work, to see with just a little bit of effort how much we can make a difference if we try. So I don't know if I want to ping pong it back to you.
Yeah. Well, so a little later, I'd like to take a look at the pictures here. These are all from the yard. We've been running tours of the yard. There's 9 distinct zones among the less than half an acre that run around the perimeter. There's the bioswale, which redirects stormwater onto the property along a winding path of pollinators, and so that filters the water before it gets to the bay, which isn't too far away. And then the next stop, and these are all with QR codes to explain to people what they're looking at. There's a native forest with, if you go out east, you'll see this pattern. You'll see pitch pine oak. And then that particular area of the yard, it's very much the sort of soil you're likely to find as you drive on the Sunrise through the
pine barrens, right?
Right. And then there's a rain garden. Then there's another area dedicated really to Fire Island. Lots of baitberry in the fire pit. And there's a willow stand and an oak stand. And the willow stand is very important. 21 willows on, everyone's like 3.5 feet apart. So it's a grove that draws all the water up, right? I got my sump pump going otherwise constantly. We planted these trees and they're like drinking straws. Yeah, so if you want to lower the water table in your yard, there are certain trees that can really help. One would be obviously the willow. The swamp maple or the red maple is a gorgeous native tree. And who else is thirsty?
Tupelos certainly. If you look at the New York State Natural Heritage Program, they actually have all these like ecological community types. It's pretty cool. They've kind of listed co-associated species, but like so tupelos, Atlantic white cedar, red maples, arrowwoods, summersweet, all these beautiful shrubs that are generally not used in the landscaping trade. Don't know why, they're gorgeous. But we kind of have that in the wet part of his yard. It's really remarkable too, because to be completely honest, Marshall's Yard is one of the bigger projects that we did first, and we we designed that bioswale such that it receives the entire block's worth of stormwater. So like,
Actually, for Main Street.
yeah. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with Sayville at all. I mean, we're pretty close, but so his house is maybe a block and a half away from the bay, and so no curbs in Suffolk County by and large, and certainly in Sayville. But everybody basically essentially built up a curb, at their yard. So anytime it rains, it's just an absolute torrent ripping down the block.
Plus, we moved there in 1965. The water's come up, maybe a foot since. Plus, all the yards have become more and more like pool tables.
Yeah.
Hard grass does not absorb, and so when it rains, you can almost time your watch. You see a wall of water coming down.
Yeah. So that used to end up in the storm drains, flooding out the storm drains, and then ultimately going right into the Great South Bay. But now it just takes a left turn into Marshall's yard, and it's just used beneficially by the plants that are there. And I laughed and I talked a good game when I convinced Marshall to let me do this. I didn't know if the thing was going to work. I thought maybe it's going to flood his house or something. But
he kept saying it worked.
but I sold him on it. But honestly, I was pretty confident in the power of these native plants, and particularly these native trees that we kind of lined the channel with. And the thing is just an absolute powerhouse. And unlike like concrete drainage infrastructure, right? And sort of the end of the pipe filtering approach to water quality initiatives, this is, when you install something precast concrete, the day like a dry well, the day you install it, it's at its most effective, right? And then it starts to degrade in its effectiveness over time. Whereas when you use nature to kind of hold on to the stormwater, the day you install it, it works pretty well, but it's at its weakest, and it only appreciates in its strength over time. As the roots start to develop and the soil becomes more porous and so on. So, it wicks up, I would say, 95% of the storms. We designed it so that it kind of kicks back out down the street instead of going to his house. But it rarely does that. It just kind of sits there and drains and it's gone. It's pretty remarkable to see.
You know that drought, how do you think the natives did? They did well. It was the non-natives that suffered. The natives have very deep roots, and they're used to it being droughty around here, even the extremes we went through. The longer the plant grows, the more elaborate the roots get, and then the more the plants form communities among each other too.
Right. Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I didn't honestly prepare any remarks. I'm just coming talking off the cuff. I could talk about plants all day. We would love this to be interactive.
Let's turn it around
yeah,
okay, what's your biggest issue with plants in your yard?
I'm supposed to hand out the mic.
Oh, goodness.
Yeah, hot mic.
Hello. So I live in a apartment over in Great Neck.
Okay.
We don't have a lot of property. We have multiple community gardens within our apartment development.
Cool.
Similar to Marshall's issue, we're at the bottom of a hill.
Right.
When it rains, the neighbors, there's a lot of, flooding that occurs.
Sure.
Especially in this garden where, a lot of people are just growing things like tomatoes, cucumbers, the regular backyard garden type of stuff. I've spoken to Marshall before about, wanting to, I walk around with native seeds and kind of throw it in my neighbor's properties.
Guerrilla gardening, right?
They don't like me so much. But we do have 2 plots within our community garden space. Is there anything that I can do, outside of doing native plants or with native plants within that
Sure.
space?
Sure, yeah. So the big thing, I guess, is to you got to give the stormwater somewhere to go, right? So oftentimes engineers, contractors, whatever, will recommend below ground storage, right? So dry wells. But think about if you have a Home Depot bucket filled with water and then you put more water on top, what happens? It just splashes over the side, right? So for the vast majority of the time, especially in situations like you're describing, the groundwater is so high, and when you need drainage the most, when it's raining and during like tidal influences, I'm not sure how close you are to the water, but nevertheless, when it's raining, the groundwater kind of comes up, and you have these subsurface drains just sitting in a puddle, so they don't really do anything. So what we generally do excuse me, is we try to capture that stormwater and give it a spot above ground to kind of hang out, right? So think of it as above ground vessel. So generally what we do is we'll dig out sort of a garden and put some rocks in the bottom, right, to create a little bit of void space, but then put everything back, and you have to channel everything towards that area and then vegetate it heavily around that. So to the extent that you can, redirect the stormwater that's kind of emanating from uplands into your little 2 plots, you can do a heck of a lot with a small space if you vegetate it properly. The key though is to figure out, as I mentioned with Marshall, we designed the overflow to kind of go back down the street. You want to make sure that there's a place for the water to go if it overwhelms the capacity of your little rain garden that you're creating. But the key to it is really redundancy, right? It's not, and it's a really good point that you brought up, a 2 little patch garden, right? Because it's all about a lot of little things as opposed to one big giant thing. So like these drainage sumps that are across Long Island, they're somewhat effective, but it's really the wrong idea. If we could all capture the stormwater coming down from our downspouts on site, that redundancy is really going to do it. So, have a beautiful native garden that captures some of the stormwater, convince the neighboring plot to do the same. That's my recommendation. Yeah. We got some seeds for you to plant.
Frank, I was speaking a little bit earlier with Joe. He has a situation.
Joe, you want to explain your situation? Got to be on the mic, I guess.
Okay. So recently we came into the sewer district in my area, and from that it kind of wiped out most of my yard. So I want to rebuild it. Came here to get a little educated on what I would put in.
Sure.
And a proper way to work it, like you say, as far as rain runoff and the plants that will come back naturally and would also help the wildlife.
Sure.
I have a small plot of land. The whole property is only 60 by 100.
Right.
But what I've never used pesticides or fertilizers.
Excellent.
And I have tons of wildlife that come. We have a small little pond, and I got the garter snakes that come, and they do their breeding season every year.
That's awesome.
And it's just great to see. It's just that now it's like I got almost a clean slate,
right.
And I want to do it right again.
So it was
I'm looking
nuked.
for some help
Yeah.
from you guys.
Yeah, well, thank you. I guess we could leave that there. So I guess a couple things to note, right? I think a mistake that a lot of my colleagues will make is just to plant native plants for the sake of it being native. And then you have like an aster that's 8 feet tall, it doesn't bloom into the fall, it looks like a weed and just kind of flops over on the first rainstorm. So the first thing I'll say is plant choice is important because what we try to do is have more of a controlled wild, right? So something that is ecologically functional, but aesthetically beautiful. And you can have both things if you're smart about the plants that you're choosing, right? So look at max height of the plant, and there's certain species like there's species of mint, for example, native mint species that are very sturdy. So I'm not saying don't have tall plants. You can have a Joe Pye weed that gets pretty tall, but plant it layered in the back with the mint in front of it to kind of hold it up, so to speak. So that's the first thing. So, but also, interestingly, and a lot of people don't think about this when they think about like native plants. The trees and shrubs are probably the neater things that you can actually plant, and plant densely. When we do our revegetation projects, or even like projects just on private lands, we plant our trees 4 to 5 foot on center, so 5 feet in between. And a lot of people think, oh, that's too close, right? But that's not actually the case. So if you go to a healthy forest, you'll see that the trees are actually very close. And what develops is what foresters refer to as timber stock, so straight trunks that kind of go up, and instead of having a token tree, right, with like a sail-like canopy, they're more like that, right? And they kind of, so they're less subject to wind throw, right? But also, the roots will actually graft underground together, and trees, even trees of different species, will share nutrients and water and other resources through the mycorrhizal network, the fungi and bacteria that develop. So perhaps somewhat of a non sequitur to what you asked, but it would be great if you had a spot to plant trees on your lot, even small lots, and to the extent that you do, if you feel like you have room for one tree, you have room for 3 trees, and 3 trees will be better than one in terms of being a neater kind of package. It'll be like a little pocket forest as opposed to one unwieldy tree that, in 20 years looks like it might fall over. Right.
Right, and a good windstorm on Long Island in Sandy Soul, you see a lot of oaks go like that.
Yeah, it's true. Did that answer your question? I mean, okay. That's exactly right. Yeah.
And the aspen, famously, they're all interconnected. It's like it's not one tree; it's a whole hillside of tree.
Yeah. And I would. Things to look at, by the way, if you're going to be picking out plants on your own, shade tolerance and wetland indicator status. Those are the 2 big life history features of plants that are like critical, right? So, so you can look up wetland indicator status on, I think the best, so there's a USDA site, but it got kind of hijacked by this company, Ladybird
Johnson Wildlife.
Wildflowers or something.
Wildflowers,
Just
yeah.
Google ladybird and native plants,
Yeah.
and it'll pop up. And
Yeah.
they actually have
LBJ's wife.
Yeah, that's right. It has a really cool database and wetland indicator status. You want to stick to things that are labeled facultative. So it goes from wetland obligate to upland, and in between is facultative. So if it's slightly wet in your yard, I would say facultative wetland or facultative. If it's slightly dry in your yard, go facultative or facultative upland. I would avoid the wetland obligate plants because they need to, need wet feet in order to survive. The other thing is shade tolerance. If you look at USDA, the Forest Service has a publication called Silvix, and they have all the common trees on the East Coast. And if you look at the section called Reaction to Competition, it'll show you a lot of stuff about the shade tolerance of the plants. So Silvix is the publication. It's an old school forester publication.
And what you're doing by reintroducing these native plants is that you're creating a complex food web. You're restoring what would be there. If you look at the plants that have been imported in, let's take the Dutch brought us a lot of lovely flowers, didn't they? The crocus and the tulip and the daffodil. And the dandelion they brought apparently with them. You will never find an insect. Will you never ever find an insect?
Rarely, anyway.
Yeah, rarely, because it takes eons, millions of years for insects to develop the enzymes necessary to break through the plant's defenses. So basically, when most of what's growing around isn't food, it's in, what happens. And what's happened since 1974 is we've lost 45% of our insects globally. And that's not a trend we want to continue. So I was so happy to see all these bugs come back in my yard. With the butterfly milkweed, there's this little beetle that I'd never seen before in my life. In fact, the day that we were planting, the day that we started, we were unloading, what was it, Joe Pye?
Yeah.
A little bucket of Joe Pye, put it down the ground. I turned, this is like June 21st, there was a monarch on it already. I hadn't seen a monarch in my yard for a decade maybe. And it was the wrong time for monarchs to be around. So I'm still scratching my head around that one.
Yeah, it's funny. A lot of our clients, this happens all the time. I mean, we pull the plants off the truck, and before we get them in the ground, you see all these like butterflies, just like, oh wow, look at
where you
there.
been?
Yeah, right. So, so I joke with my clients now. Oh, we brought them with us. They come with every planting, right? So it's kind of true, to be honest.
We took a driveway that had been there 100 years, blacktop. Scraped it up, I got some dirt from who knows what vacant lot. And then that was November 2020, September 2021, we had all this butterfly milkweed there. We had 40 monarchs come in at the same time.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really startling. And you just, you rekindle a wonder for nature. Now, I grew up in the woods and swamps and bays around here, and with Save the Great South Bay, I thought that, I learned a lot about the marine world then, but increasingly I came to see that the problems of our bays really begin on the mainland. The bays are symptoms, it's the mainland that's sick. All the water that's coming off the land. And what we need to do is we need to filter that water before it reaches, in the case of the Great South Bay, there's 50 creeks, rivers, and streams flowing in. So we started with the Creek Defender program, planting natives along the creek sides, and the Bay Friendly Yards program, again, natives in the yard. So we can all, make a difference. And by the way, it's also, as far as I've been able to tell, cheaper just to go native, because no water, no pesticides, no fertilizer. And I got to talk to you about removing the rest of my lawn so I don't have to mow it anymore.
Okay. Yeah, so it's a good point to kind of bring wetland water quality back into the picture, right? Because what's cool about all of these projects is that you can look at it through a different lens. The same project does a million different things, right? Adaptation and mitigation of climate change, right? You plant a bunch of trees and you sequester carbon, okay. But also, what about nitrogen, right? So you hear, a lot of researchers will talk about sanitary systems and our wastewater that enters the Great South Bay as, the biggest problem. And it is a huge problem, no doubt. We have to take care of our wastewater infrastructure. That is true. But it's inextricably linked to stormwater issues, right? In a lot of different ways. So first of all, when you're maintaining the stormwater on site, and having these native plants that are sort of adapted to the soil, similar to carbon sequestration, there's a process called nitrogen assimilation. So the nitrogen literally just gets sucked up into the plant tissue and just sticks there, right? And there's a number of different there's a number of different processes associated with the nitrogen cycle, right? So sometimes the native plants will encourage, with their root bacteria, will encourage denitrification, which is taking the nitrogen and gassing it into the atmosphere, right, and putting it back, right? Because I would say 70 or 80% of our atmosphere is actually nitrogen, and it's falling out of the sky as we speak, and especially when it rains, right? And the fate of that nitrogen depends entirely on where that nitrogen lands. So if it lands on concrete, obviously it flushes right out to the bay, right? But if it lands on a forest, it largely sticks, right? It's a very tight nitrogen cycle. But if it lands on your lawn, it does not stick, right? Think about how deep the roots are of the lawn and how co-evolved the bacteria are with these non-native grass species that we use. And by the way, I have no judgment. I have a lawn. My kid runs around on the lawn, but we bite off in the margins of our lawn every single year. Just bringing it back to wastewater, what do you think is pushing all of the nitrogen load out of all these septic systems? It's these pulses of stormwater that come through the environment, right? So if we all kept, and this is why I go back to redundancy with your question before, if we all kept a little bit of the stormwater on our land, there would be the pulses of groundwater that goes through the environment would not be nearly as intense or frequent, and the amount of nitrogen getting pushed out of these dirty old septic systems will be a lot less as well. So certainly upgrade to the IA system. The county will pay for most of that to the extent that you can. But don't sleep on the fact that these native plants are, I would say more than half of the problem here is how we steward our land or don't steward it, as it were. So
I'll give an example where they're going to be sewering in Oakdale. There was some $430 million that was to go to coastal restoration or resiliency and went for sewering. But anyhow, that's what happened. And so it's 480 houses, all half acre. And I said, so how much nitrogen are you going to be taking out here per unit per year? About 30 pounds for a family of 4. And I said, well, what's happening on the lawn? Well, looks like you're about 15 pounds of nitrogen are being put on the lawn at the same time. So isn't there a disconnect here? So what if you could plant native plants at the same time that you are installing these sewer connections, the native plants would not be contributing to nitrogen. In fact, it would do the opposite. So if the whole goal is to reduce nitrogen, let's do that by planting natives as well as sewering.
Right. And sewering is not a panacea, right? Like, think about the western bays on Long Island, right? They're a mess. They're every year there's brown tides, worse than the Great South Bay, and it's all sewered.
Just moving the problem elsewhere.
Right. Again, not to denigrate those professionals that are upgrading wastewater infrastructure. We're actually, Spadefoot's working on our license to install some of these nitrogen removing biofilters. So it's like a process that you have to go through with the county to be an approved vendor. So I'm all for upgrading sewage infrastructure, but we could sewer all of Long Island, and we're still screwed if we have a little kid here. We're still stuck if we don't. If we don't. What's that? Yeah, fair enough. We're still stuck if we don't learn to steward the land. But again, this is not a Sierra Club doom and gloom announcement here, right? We can do it, right? We just have to try a little bit. Each of us tries a little bit, and the biggest thing, and I think Marshall hit on this, that I think that you can do in your yard if you're not into replacing it all with natives. I mean, not everybody's as brave as Marshall, to be honest, is addition by subtraction. Getting rid of the invasive plants in your yard. So if you want to keep the ornamentals, the holly or whatever, the Japanese holly that doesn't go anywhere, fine. It might as well be a statue to the birds. It doesn't provide any ecological function, but it also doesn't spread and destroy forests. Whereas things like Oriental bittersweet, things like privet, things like burning bush, what's the other one? The Japanese barberry. I sourced some of it outside. I'm sorry, guys. Here,
it's true.
What happens
and
is
you can't unsee it now.
Yeah, you don't need, and you can't. But what happens is that the birds, so I get this all the time. My burning bush doesn't spread. Okay, tell that to the forest where the entire understory is burning bush. The birds eat your berries, fly off, poop, and make more burning bush. Right? That's how it happens. So
well, I got a real good example. You're seeing it everywhere. It's probably strangling about 1 million trees on Long Island, and it's providing cover for the white-footed mouse, which is a major carrier of Lyme disease, and that plant is English ivy.
Right.
Yeah. So that's what happens. The predators that would normally keep the mouse population down, your owls, your hawks, your cats even, they're in the ivy, you can't see them. And these are, not terribly hygienic animals, they're rodents, and they carry the bacteria that gives the disease. The deer is merely a carrier so that the adults can grow and then drop their eggs on the forest.
Right.
So if you want, if you want to really contribute to getting rid of Lyme disease, it's not a bad idea to get rid of the English ivy. If you look, the English ivy is all at the forest edge where the deer and people meet. Right. Because the birds come, they grab a berry from somewhere, from someone's yard, poop it on the forest edge, of course. And that's where it all happens, as people get bit. So it's a bit complicated. Would you agree with that analysis?
English ivy is probably one of my most hated plants. It kills full-grown adult trees, right? So next time you drive down the southern state or the northern state, take a look at the vestigial forests that are there. Yeah, right. So, but I'll say, it is pretty exhausting work, right? We usually take a mini excavator and scrape it up, right? Because it can get a lot, and it grows so perniciously. But if you're feeling so inclined, honestly, the best thing that you can do, ideally get rid of all of it, but at least clip it at the base of the trees. Save the trees, and it doesn't typically produce berries until it goes vertical onto a tree. So if you don't have the energy to get rid of the carpet of English ivy, at least don't let it kill all your trees.
It's so cool to watch it wither all the way down. Don't pull it, because that'll damage the bark, and you get a fungal infection, it'll kill the tree.
Right. So any other questions? We're sort of just...
Any invasive that particularly terrifies you? Any native I don't know what's going on in your yard. Anything good? You gentlemen over here haven't spoken yet. You had the lovely.
All right.
I'm in an apartment right now, so I don't really have these problems yet.
Yeah.
Right.
I am trying to get ideas for the future, though, potentially. When we eventually do get a house. I was just wondering, though, something that you guys were talking about, and I clearly don't have the information on this, so I just want to learn from what you guys know.
Sure.
When you're talking about planting native species and those plants then being easier to take care of than invasive species, I came in here thinking it was the opposite, because invasive species have been able to take over and kill off the native species.
Sure.
So I thought those were, better able to survive in our
Right.
climate. So how is that the case?
Yeah, you're missing a category: ornamental species, right? So invasive species, to your point, crowd out, kill, take over. It's pretty easy to grow English ivy, right? And privet, for example, and you can't contain it typically. So ornamental species, though, like these Japanese hollies and arborvitaes is actually a clone of a native species, but nonetheless, these things that you get from Home Depot, basically everything that you get from Home Depot, they need special care. I mean, you drive out east and you see all these people wrapping their little trees, boxwoods and whatnot, right? So the native species generally can be out-competed by invasive species in disturbed circumstances, right? So there's a natural complexity and stability of a healthy woodland that kind of, you have deep shade and you have roots that are all knit together and keeping out the invasive species. But the second you take a backhoe and rip out, cause a gap in the canopy, suddenly these not invasive propagules will be able to spread and kind of choke out and infiltrate the edges of the forest, as Marshall, it's referred to in the field as edge effect, right? So invasive species need to be ripped out, and that's the biggest thing you can do to steward the land, is not have invasive species. If you have an ornamental species, like I inherited a bunch of ornamental species on my property, but I haven't run out of real estate to plant the natives yet, right? So at some point we might rip those out and the ornamentals. But the ornamentals don't bother me as much because they don't, destroy the forests and whatnot.
Yeah, they're relatively keep to themselves, so relatively harmless. You go to the garden store and they'll say, this one is great, the insects don't bother it. So it's at best a missed opportunity to put something in the environment that has some ecological use. Looks pretty, doesn't do much.
All right, so I have a question as far as the reconstruction of my property, and I'm leaning towards like elderberry, and is that a good choice to put in elderberry bushes?
It needs wet feet. It's a facultative wetland plant, so you can put it in
A rain garden.
Yeah, where your downspouts come down. I would try to capture that stormwater and let it live there. It has, that's right. It's a wetland plant generally.
And you can make wine out of it too.
I just, just characterize in your land patterns of shade and hydrology, and that's, I would say, 80% of the science. And if you want some help, I'm happy to help. Yeah, sure.
So for those taking notes or have a decent memory, there's a book I'd recommend to you all, as I'm sure Frank would, called Nature's Best Hope. It's by a Professor Douglas Tallamay. It's a New York Times bestseller. And it's really a blueprint for how each of us can make a difference starting in our own yard. So that's what he's arguing, is let's plant native habitat in our yards, and he has something called the Homegrown National Park, where your own yard becomes where you re-encounter nature. And we're seeing that again and again with our customers at Spadefoot, and in our own lives. It's really miraculous, I think. And what we're trying to do in Sayville with the Long Island Conservancy is to plant at the library, plant at the Chamber of Commerce, plant in whatever parks or open spaces we can, and do it as a community. So that's really the model that we're running by in Huntington and Port Washington, is to really create a spirit of local stewardship, because that's the only way this is going to happen. It's a big job.
And for those in apartments especially, but even if you have a house, we have events where we'll go out and actually free full-grown trees from English ivy, and if you want to spend some time in the field with us, come help, play in the dirt for a little while, and you'll feel really good at the end of the day.
Nothing happens unless you get your fingernails dirty.
That's
It's true.
true.
And I've seen it again and again. There'll be a bunch of people show up for a invasive removal, and the look in their faces after just exhausted and scratched and but I was out a couple hours today, and I'm suspending my gym membership for a month or two until we get through all the weeding season.
Right.
Well, yes.
Yeah. Wait, hold on. Hot mic.
So I think back to my previous question before.
Yeah.
Obviously I'd like to get a little bit more involved with the current gardening situation within my apartment complex. Part one, I guess, is removal of the invasive species priority over the planting of the native species.
For sure.
And two, because we're incredibly close to kind of just more of a urban scenario and living, there's definitely a concern for things like pests. I know you were mentioning the different mice that carried Lyme's disease. Is there a concern that I should have with that as well in the current invasive species that are living in our city?
Yeah, I mean, look, if you're bringing nature in, natural predators will come too. So if you have, you're not going to support much in like a 2-plot garden. Sure. That's the first point. But even to the extent that you bring in, at my house in Huntington, it was like a suburban hellscape when I moved in, right? It was just all lawn and like a Japanese maple or whatever. Suddenly, we restored a big portion of it. I took out a huge patch of multiflora rose, which is Japanese and whatever, and I see these darn mice get into my garage. But sure enough, the hawks are keeping them down at this point. I see hawks all the time in my yard.
Yeah,
I've
seen osprey and Cooper's hawks, and it's almost a Central Park effect. You know what
Right.
I mean? All the nature sort of converges there because every place else is kind of dead zone.
And just from a practical standpoint, it's more about keeping them out of your house and the living spaces than keeping them out. Of course, you don't want rats, which are not native, by the way. But these white-footed mice and whatnot, they're kind of cute, and my son likes them. And when we use humane traps, and I don't let him really touch them, but we'll pick them up, put them in a big bin, and drive them a couple miles away, and drop them off. And my son is
I've been shaking
oh,
habanero sauce down with it.
Yeah. But you just look for their entry points into the living spaces. So no, I don't really have any concerns in that regard.
I mean, I really wish that we get an audience with Fairfield. They have dozens of apartment complexes, and it's all mow and blow. That's all they know. But
Right.
that's true of a lot of organizations.
There you go. Sure thing.
So I actually do foundation waterproofing for a living. I've done a lot of work in the houses, so I know really my life is water tables and runoff
Yeah.
and everything like that. So it's really awesome to kind of hear, guys that really know what they're talking about talk
thank
about
you.
it. And it's something that, I run into clients all the time that are always kind of, asking me what they can do, to resolve, issues that they're having.
Right.
Because I really know the power of, the benefit power of putting certain plants in one spot.
Sure.
And then the opposite way where put it in the wrong spot can really kind of
Right.
make a certain flooding problem worse. So is there anything maybe specific I could sort of pass on to clients of mine?
So, beyond my field work in biological science, I actually learned a boatload by, there's a 4-hour DEC course. Are you familiar with it? The stormwater?
No.
Oh yeah. So it costs a couple $100 or something, but they talk all about stormwater cutoffs, and it's really just understanding that there's two real, I mean, they're sort of this one and the same in real life, but academically they're discrete things. So overland flow, stuff coming out of the downspouts, and then there's sheet flow. That's the one thing that a lot of people kind of don't pay attention to. So basically, going from upland to lowland, water just oozes through the environment, right? And then piled on top of that is all of the downspouts from your lawn or just your patio running off and piling on top of the sheet flow. So it's in reality it's one and the same, right? But to the extent that you're getting water intrusion in a basement, right, beyond just dry locking the inside of it, right, figure out how to divert that and put it to a beneficial use. And that's I'll recommend again that DEC contractors course. It's a pretty good one for that.
Yeah, very cool. I'm definitely gonna look into that.
Now,
Cool.
just seeing as you mentioned foundations, we are talking about invasives. I cannot not talk about Japanese knotweed. Japanese knotweed is an enormous problem in England because it started there a little earlier with gardening became a global thing around the Victorian period, and so a lot was planted there. If you have Japanese knotweed on your property in England, the value of the property goes down by as much as 15%. Why? The roots go right through the foundations.
You can't even get a loan.
Can't even get a
Yeah.
loan, and because there's no, once it's there, it's there. And the reason the roots are so powerful is it grows around volcanoes in Japan. It's going through the volcanic rock. So try getting a foundation that's going to stand up against that. So there are some. We got to figure out how to kill this thing.
Yeah,
I mean, this is
we
really
kill
bad.
we kill
And
it.
it's here. It's here.
We kill it with an excavator, Marshall.
Well, because they didn't know any better. Here's another example of things happening because people didn't know any better. And we're trying to do something about that right now. The American chestnut. 1904, there were anywhere between 1 and 4 billion American chestnuts up and down the eastern seaboard. It was the keystone species, feeding everything else. Now it's the oak, but then it was the chestnut. And they imported a Chinese, they being the New York Botanical Society, brought in a Chinese chestnut that had a little fungus on it. Within, 2 decades, pretty much gone, right? And so we're working now to help to bring back the species. We have some 75 saplings now.
We have more than that, but I'm the co-director of the American Chestnut Foundation, like locally here, and to Marshall's point, I mean, these things, like if you Google American chestnut, you'll see like entire families with their arms around these trees that were like,
Giants.
half the size of this room here that we're in. I mean, like enormous, right? And who knows about the biodiversity that we lost when we lost the chestnuts?
Well, the passenger pigeon, they used to blacken the skies. They ate those things.
Fair enough.
Extinct
Yep.
in 1938.
So what we're left with are these vestigial populations. So the chestnut blight, what it does is it girdles the tree. So the circulatory system of a tree is in the top, the xylem and the phloem. So basically the very top kind of layers under the bark is where all the water goes up and the carbohydrates go down. And so the fungus basically cuts that off and kills these things.
Very effectively.
Excuse me, I had the flu a couple weeks ago and this little lingering cough, I apologize. What happens is that we have these like thriving root systems, right? That suckers up after the big tree dies, lives to about 30 years old, succumbs to the blight, and falls back over again.
It's like Groundhog's Day. It keeps
Reemerging. So the American Chestnut Foundation started this back cross hybrid. So they basically tried to breed Chinese chestnuts with American chestnuts to get the American chestnuts, it's like to have a hybrid that's blight resistant, but American. But turns out genetics is pretty damn complicated, and so to the extent that we have like hybrids that resist the blight, they're more Chinese chestnut than anything. So recently, within the last decade, SUNY ESF, it's up by the Syracuse campus, they use CRISPR, which is this genetic engineering tool, to they just inserted a wheat gene into the Chinese American chestnut genome to make it blight resistant.
How did they figure that?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty remarkable. And so what we've been doing here locally on Long Island, and I can't take credit for this, my co-director is crazy enough to climb these vestigial things like 60 in the air.
First we find them,
Yeah,
which
well,
is always fun.
But he's up there hand pollinating these vestigial populations of American. Yeah, I know, she's shaking her head. I do the same. He has these like tree stands, and I'm just like, I'm not going up there. You know, I'll take pictures. You know, so then he hand pollinates these things, goes and collects the nuts, and then sells them to me. And we kind of put them into a commercial growing operation. And so right now we have about 100 American chestnuts and they're all local genetic American chestnuts, and we have mother orchards that we're planting throughout Long Island. And in next year, when SUNY ESF finally gets the approval from the regulators to release this genetically engineered stock, we're going to take the transgenic American chestnut, which by the way is like 99.9 something percent American chestnut, and then crossbreed them with the Long Island wild types. And what you'll get is the resulting progeny, at least 50% of them, will be Long Island American chestnut that is blight resistant, so we can go out and repopulate the forest with this stuff.
And
so
then
I'm
we
really
can see
excited
about
it.
Doing a Jurassic Park on the pigeon.
Right.
I feel good about that.
Yeah. Nobody ever. What do they say? Nobody ever stopped to think that they should or something. Right. Anyway, I'm not one for cultural references, but I got a couple chuckles. Yeah, thank you for that.
So in sum, it's just all about local stewardship, starting in your yard and in your community, and people. Not everyone will get it initially, but what we're seeing out there is, the demand for this, the understanding of what this all means. It's really grown.
Yeah, it truly is. And we've seen, and there's actually research backing this up, is that I think there's some people who like do what they do and they're like, with pride, like, pesticides, and like, I'm gonna have a perfect fluorescent lawn, right? But that's such a small minority. I think the vast majority of Long Islanders, and this is sort of the epicenter of like suburban like living, right? Is Levittown. It all kind of spread throughout the all the way out to California,
all the way out to Riyadh, to places all over the four corners of the world. We exported the suburban lifestyle to the rest of the world, including cars, of course.
Yeah, but what I'll say is that I think it's mostly conformity and lacking awareness. And and Marshall's said a couple times, you can't really unsee it. Once you're out there and you start to learn about nature, live in your yard and kind of plant things, and plant this and it fails, and you try something else, and all of a sudden you have a swarm of monarchs on your yard. You really you can't unsee it, and it's so darn contagious. But why? Why are you doing that, Marshall? Like, why is your yard like that? Oh my gosh, this is like buzzing with life. And then all of a sudden, they want to do it, and 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 we're booked out through May because people want to do this. And I'm so grateful for the opportunity to restore nature. And what I'll say is that, again, I said this already, but just at the risk of repeating myself, if we all do a teeny bit, it adds up to such a huge boon to the environment, boon to water quality and our way of life as humans. And if we don't do it, we're stuck. But I think we're going to do it. I'm fundamentally, I firmly believe that the climate models don't take into effect, how drastically deforestation is actually driving climate change, right? But it works the other way too, and it happens quickly, right? So to the extent that we can kind of go out and you plant 3 trees, and everybody here does that at some point, maybe in your community garden, maybe guerrilla gardening, right? As sort of I mentioned, we all do a little, it'll add up to a lot, and I'm so grateful to kind of be part of this process.
And this is generational work, and I think people are getting. I was down at a climate conference in Miami in early March, 2,500 people from around the world, and I did not expect to come home feeling optimistic. Did not expect that.
Right.
And it was because I saw how all these different constituencies were pulled together, all the different elements that you would actually need for us to take on this enormous challenge.
Right.
And you know, there are innovations in this field that you know, I place a lot of faith as a technologist in them, and you know, we're still fighting.
Right, and you know, the biggest innovation is to mimic nature, right? I mean, it's, you know, why reinvent the wheel? Nature knows what she's doing. So you know, we biological scientists have done a whole lot to kind of lay out these different community types, what should be where, how, what knits together, and how and why. So it just takes some elbow grease, and I think that we'll turn the corner on this thing way quicker than, you know, in our lifetimes.
Well, to close, I really want to thank DubCo Brewery and for inviting us to be part of this For Science series, because this is very much about science and understanding its implications, and knowing how we each can play a part in you know, restoring nature in our communities. So I know DubCo is highly invested here locally with all the different places you can get DubCo. So looking forward to getting this recorded and out, and moving on to the next topic.
Yeah.
Thank you.